Okay, and the final thing we need to do to sort of start using this for previs is know how to actually render out and add cameras, make a sequence, that sort of thing. So first of all, to add in a sequence, which is how you get your timeline, you need to click on the clapperboard here, the drop down menu, and click add level sequence. Then I always save this in a folder, so I'm just going to stick it in the levels folder and just call this sequence. And there you go, once you've saved it, you get access to the timeline. So we're obviously going to want to move into cinematic mode as well. So come and click on the perspective button in the top left corner, click on cinematic viewport, and it will move your camera back to the default position. So you're going to need to just move that back to where you were. But what this does, it allows us to add in the sort of play, stop, record buttons. But also in the top right hand corner, we now have this new button which allows us to add over some composition overlays. So if you want a 3x3 grid, if I just look away for a second, there you go, you get the 3x3 grid, or maybe you want the 2x2 grid, or no grid at all. You can also add in letterboxing. So if you want it to be the cinematic aspect ratio, you can add in the letterboxing. There you go, you can see top and bottom there that you can have those sort of viewport guides, so you can see what's going to be cinematic and what's not, that sort of thing. You can also change the color of these as well as your safe areas. So you can make these solid black, or you can make them bright pink if you want them to make it really super obvious. I normally leave them as slightly transparent just so I know what's on either side, and just sometimes I do change the color if I'm working in a dark scene, for example. Might change them to red or green so I can see what's going on, that sort of thing. So we now have our composition guides, which is really useful, but the composition guides are only going to be useful if we can have a camera point of view. Now, there's a few ways to add in a camera. We can press this button down here, the little camera button. If you click that, it will snap your view to be that of what the camera is. And it also automatically adds in your camera into the sequencer. But if I just undo that, we can also add in a camera by going to Place Actors, searching for a cine camera actor, dragging and dropping that. I'm just going to focus in on that camera. If you can't see your camera like I couldn't see it there, press G and it will bring the camera icon back. Now what we can do is we can select this camera, so it's got the orange outline, click Track, Actor to Sequence, and click Add Cine Camera Actor to Sequence, and this will then snap us to the view and add it to the sequencer again. Now, if you don't want to be snapped to the view of the camera, there's two ways we can undo this. So we can click this little camera button here, that will snap us either to or not, or we can press the eject button when we're in. But obviously you can't then snap back to the camera view because that button's gone now. So you could right click on it, or you click pilot, or you can just click the snap button down here, which I always find slightly easier because you don't have to find the camera then in the world. And now that we're in our camera, we can start playing around with the settings. So the main settings you can change, and they are here in the sequencer. If you do want to change them, I just find them slightly easier to use over here in the details panel. But we'll start with the first one, which is the look at settings. So this allows you to select an object that you want the camera to look at, and then basically ask the camera to always look at that. So if we check the enable look at settings and then come down to the actor to track, this is basically asking you to choose the object you want it to look at. So I'm going to choose the visitor center as the object to look at. Now, when I fly the camera around and the camera control settings are exactly the same, you'll notice that the camera is not tracking to that sort of center point. And that's because it hasn't sort of had a moment to think about it. There you go. So if you move, I'm still in control here, but as soon as I let go, it will then snap the camera so that the visitor center is always in the center of the frame. Now, maybe we don't want the visitor center to be in the center of the frame. Maybe we want it to be slightly offset. So we can actually offset the sort of camera using the XYZ coordinates, we can sort of move the camera up, down, forwards, back, depending on sort of what we want to offset it, using the relative offset XYZ coordinates there. And we're going to want to allow a roll. That basically allows us to spin the camera. You might not want that, but I think that could be useful. Next one is the sensor size, or the film back. This is basically talking about the size of the image that you want to render out. So when you render something out, even if you've got these letterboxes on, the letterboxes won't be rendered. It will render in whatever aspect ratio your sensor size is, so or the film back size. So it's default set to 16:9. That's most monitors are 16:9. It's a very, very common aspect ratio, but there are some preset ones as well. IMAX is obviously a popular one if you're making an IMAX film, or using the 35mm Academy. This is the Academy standard, so a lot of major film sets are using this if they're shooting on proper film, but a lot of us are using sort of the 16:9 film sensors. And the 24mm by 13.5mm is a similar size to that of the Red weapon cameras or the RE Alexas, that sort of thing. They have a sensor size very similar to this. Then we can move on to our lens settings. So there's two types of lenses. There are obviously prime lenses and zoom lenses. Prime lenses are fixed lenses. They only have one focal length, so one amount of zoom, and obviously they have their f-stop, or the aperture, so how much light they're letting in, as well as does a zoom lens, but the zoom obviously allows you to zoom in and out. So by default it's set to zoom, because we can increase or decrease the current zoom, or the current focal length as it's known properly. We can change that, and you can see my camera is zooming in and out. So we have a really fisheye lens here, and then we have a really zoomed in version there as well, telephoto view of the visitor center as well. So by default that's set to 35mm. Again, there are some pre-made lenses here. The default aperture is 2.8. That's a very, very cinematic look. If you own your own DSLR, it's normally sort of slightly smaller aperture, so it's normally around 5.6 as an average. But the more pro you get with your photography and your videography, the aperture is generally going to get wider, just because it gives that cinematic look. It affects what's called the bokeh, or the depth of field, how sort of blurred out the background is. That can be affected by your aperture. So I'm going to leave those as is at the moment. We'll change them when we start sort of keyframing in the actual camera settings. Now, the focus settings. This is what obviously the camera is going to be focused at. Where is going to be blurry and where is not. And how do we look at that? Well, we need the helpful little debug menu. So if you check this box here, you should see, now it's behind the visitor center for us, so I can't see it at the moment. But if you check this box, you'll get by default a purple square. So if I move this forward, we can now see that everything on the line of the purple square is what's going to be in focus. So if I was to leave that focused on the door and then zoom right in to the door frame, you can now see the door is what is in focus. Whereas if I move this back, the door will go out of focus. Move it forwards, back in focus. So always use the debug pane. But one thing that is important to note, the debug pane will render. So if you have it checked, the checkbox, and you see the purple line, when you click render, it will render in there as well. It's there for breakdowns and things like that if you want to do a piece for your portfolio. You can also change the color of it when you have it checked. If you want it to be red or orange or whatever, you can set it to a custom color. It's just purple by default. So that's a really useful tool. If you want it to track a certain object, again, similar to the look at settings, you can select an object, and you will notice now that whenever I move away, we have the focus settings and the camera look at settings are always going to snap back and focus on the visitor center, which is really, really useful, because now I can do any shot and I know that that is going to be what my camera is going to look at. So really, really useful trick there. So I'm just going to, now that I know it's focused, I'm going to turn off my debug menu because it'll always be in focus for me. Okay, those are the main things that you want to change on your camera. So coming down to how we actually animate our camera, this works very, very similarly to any other keyframing software. So imagine this is After Effects, and you have your keyframe, the before and after, and then the add keyframe menu button. So if I wanted to add my transform, so the location of my camera, I can click open the drop down menu just to see the location, rotation, or scale, which is what's underneath this. But you just have to believe me, it's a scale here. I can change any one of those, or I can do all three of them using the transform heading. I can just keyframe that. Now, Unreal is very useful. You can select the thing you want to keyframe and just press enter, and you can see that it has added in 3 keyframes. So if I close that, they group up to be the 1 keyframe. So I can get rid of that keyframe because I don't want this to be my start position. I want something a bit closer. So I'm going to, I'm actually going to turn off the track look at, just so I can control what we're actually looking at. And I'm going to want to do something that sort of looks like we're getting closer to the visitor center. So I'm going to start the camera off here. So I'm just going to press enter, and you can see it's added the camera. And then I'm just going to go to the end of the timeline, push forward a little bit so that, and maybe up as well, just so that we have something that looks cool. And then just going to line those up. There we go. Press enter again to add in the keyframe. And now what we have is an animated camera. Nice and simple, nice and easy to use as well. But you can see it's interpolating, it's speeding up and then slowing down as well. Maybe we want the camera to be constant. Well, we need to change what type of keyframes we're using. So you can select your keyframes or just one of them, right click on them, and then you can see here we have all the different types of keyframes. So there's keyframe auto, keyframe user, keyframe break, linear, and constant. So to keep it a constant speed, we're going to want it to be linear, where there is no interpolation. Now this will remain the same speed throughout, and that's what we want. But maybe I want to control the amount of speeding up and slowing down there is. So this is where we can use our good friend, the graph editor, or as it's known in Unreal, the curve editor. So under this little graph looking box, if you click that, we get our graph editor, and this allows us to change the settings of our speeding up and slowing down, the interpolation of this. So maybe I don't want to speed it up so much, or maybe I want it to speed up loads and then bounce back. We can change all of these settings using the nice handles to create some funky looking curves until we have something that we like the look of. Now, let's say I was to add another keyframe here. I now have these handles all together which I can use. That might be what we want to do. That might be sort of the keyframe we want to add in there. But I'm just going to add a single key to make this slightly easier to use. There we go. You can see that this is adding in a curve on both sides of equal portions. I can't change anything without changing the other side of the curve. That's not what we want at all. What we want is something that, or maybe that is what we want. Maybe we want to use the user, and what this allows us to do is basically lock in any other curves either side of it, or maybe we want to edit either side individually. So we can now use the break, and this is how we could get a bounce effect. So if I was just to put this to one side, we could actually have our camera bounce sort of through its scene. And just to clarify there, I realize I sort of skipped over it, so apologies for that. What I mean by user is it won't affect anything before or after it, sort of with the lock effect. So up until the next keyframe is what it's changing. It won't change anything before or after that, unlike the auto, just so you know. Linear, as we said, has no interpolation, so it's going to be a straight line, so it'd be a bit pointless there by itself. It just keeps it very constant. And then the final one, constant, gives you a value which will remain the same until the next keyframe. Okay. So for now, I'm actually just going to change both of these to be linear because I just want the camera to zoom in nice and easily. Okay. Now, because we've set our focus distance to track the object, I don't actually need to add any keyframes in for our focus distance because it will do it automatically for me. But you might need to if you haven't used these tracking settings. For the aperture, you might notice that as I change the aperture, nothing's really changing in the scene, and that is because we haven't used one of our secret tools. And that secret tool is called the post-processing volume. Okay, so we're going to search for post-process volume. There we go. And what this is it's a little invisible cube that allows us to add in some sort of post-processing effects during the actual render process. So, like our eyes, Unreal by default will change the exposure of the camera to always be as constant as possible. So it means you could increase or decrease the aperture or the ISO settings on your camera, and everything will look as the same as possible, which isn't really true to how cameras work. And as visual effects artists and animators, we want to make everything seem as real as possible because it helps the audience understand there's some sort of realism to what we're creating. So first things first, click on your post-process volume and search for infinite. And we want to extend the box to be basically infinite. Although it's now a box, everything outside the box is also included. If this checkbox isn't checked, only the things inside the box are going to be affected by the settings that we change. Okay. Now what we can do is search for exposure. And under metering mode, we're going to change this to manual, and everything's going to get very dark, but don't worry, because we're just going to check the next box and set this to a value between 8 and 12, which, yes, the comedians of you will say that's just 10, but the value between 8 and 12 is generally where the sweet spot is. So 8's a bit too dark, 12's a bit too bright, 10 works well. But you might want to play around with this artistically, which is why I say generally a value between 8 and 12 is where we want it to be. Now what this means is when we snap back to my camera, when I change the aperture, you can see here it now acts like a real camera. So the smaller the aperture, the sort of darker it's getting because the less light's getting through, and the wider the aperture, the brighter it's getting. And that allows us again to play around with how cinematic we want it to be. So I'm going to set this to be 2.8, but I'm then going to search for the ISO settings, and I'm going to turn the ISO down a bit to, let's say, 50, just because I think it's a little bit too bright at the moment. Okay. So that has now changed our ISO settings as well as the overall exposure. But what if we have our light source, which I'm just going to move around, behind our object? Surely there would be some sort of lens flare. Well, yes, of course, we can add that in if you want. So go to your post-process volume again and search for, surprise, surprise, lens flare. And just check the intensity box. And then you might want to play around with those settings. Now, mine isn't quite looking at the sun enough to actually cause a lens flare. It's not going to do it at all, which is quite annoying. But sometimes the lens flares work, sometimes they don't. It's really up to you on how you sort of control those, but you just have to take my word for it. Check the intensity box and then change the values until you get something which looks like what you want it to. Personally, I'm not going to use it on this. The other one you can use is the bloom, and this is basically affecting how much glow it adds to a scene. So I always find a little bit of bloom actually helps quite a lot. So just to show you the difference there, it's sort of allowing that sort of murkiness on your lens a little bit. It just adds in that sense of realism of the sun is actually really that bright. at the moment just looks like underexposed sun. Now it looks like overexposed sun. It's actually causing a slight flaring effect anyway. So and as we move the sun around, obviously the bloom is going to follow as well. So I'm now going to just pick somewhere that I want the light to be. I'm just going to, there, that's quite a nice view. Okay. So now we might want to add in something like a car or a dinosaur if you were actually making Jurassic Park, and you want to begin animating that. So this is the last thing I'm going to show you before I show you how to render out. So let's pretend this cube here is our dinosaur. So I'm actually just going to make it very slightly bigger so that we can see it from the camera. Okay, now we have our cube. We could animate this. We could spend ages animating this using the animation tab, but it's not going to do anything unless we add it to our sequencer. So in the sequencer, click track, click add actor, and we could scroll through here to find what it's called, which is cube 3, or if you've got it selected, you'll see it up here, add cube 3. And then underneath here, you can't see it at the moment because it's hidden, there we go, by this little menu here, but it has the transform value, same as the camera did before. We can add in those values of the dinosaur walking forward very slowly. Maybe it wants to turn a little bit, face the camera, that sort of thing. Okay, and we're just gonna pretend that's our animation done. Easy peasy. Anything else you want to add into the sequencer, same process. Track, actor to sequence, click on what you want to add, or if you've got it selected, click on the add selection button, and then you're all good. You're all good to go in your animation. And that's a very easy way to create a nice animation. But it's only going to be any good if we can render it out. And really easy to render in Unreal. We simply just come to the render button here, but it's always good to check that you have the correct render queue plugin. In Unreal Engine 5, they added in the movie render queue, which was a sort of beta test beforehand, but now it is the official renderer. If you only see legacy mode when you click on these 3 dots next to the clapperboard in the sequencer, then you need to add the plugin. So go to Edit, Plugins, and search for movie render queue. And then check this box. It'll ask you to restart. Click yes. It'll then ask you to save. Obviously save everything. And then when it restarts, you'll have access to the movie render queue. And when you click this button, this is what will load. This is the movie render queue. You can see it says unsaved config. Now, after a while of rendering, once you've got used to the settings, you might start saving your own configurations of render just to speed up your process. Which could be really useful, but at the moment we're just going to work with what we've got, which is the unsaved config. So if you click on that, it's a link to the settings. Click on output. First things first is you want to choose somewhere to send it. So just click on the 3 dots, then make a folder is what I suggest. I'm just going to make a folder in my content drawer. No, not in my content drawer. Do not make it in your content drawer. Go back out into just your project folder if you're going to send it there. Always make sure your content folder is left for content in the project. I'm just going to call this render. Open up that folder. You can see there it's actually thrown up an error, so you might want to move that out of that folder as well. I'm just going to move it into my Unreal project folder. And then we need to give the render items a name. So you can see here that it says sequence underscore name in brackets, full stop, and then in brackets, frame number. We need to keep everything in the brackets up to the full stop at the end. Okay, so everything before the full stop, including the brackets that says sequence name, you can change that, or you can leave it to be whatever the sequence is called. So my sequence is called SEQ, short for sequence. Or you can give this a specific name. So I'm going to call it render, but you must make sure it says full stop and then in brackets frame number. Okay, if you don't have that, the render won't happen. You can change your output resolution here if you want. Make sure it matches the ratio of your film back settings. So 16:9 is equal to 1920 to 1080. If you want 4K, it's 3840 by 2160. Okay, that's now 4K. If you have a custom frame rate, let's say you accidentally left it at 30 frames per second like I did, you can change this in the settings, but once you click render, you can only change it here by using custom frame rate. I always suggest making sure you set it up correctly the first time. It shouldn't affect anything once you've sort of changed everything. It shifts everything so that it matches the speed still. If you forget to change that, just change it here to be 24 frames per second if that's what you're working with, or whatever frame rate you're working with other than that. Now, it will render it out as a JPEG sequence. You might want to render this out as a PNG sequence, so you can turn that off, click Add Settings, and then search for PNG. This will just obviously not compress it as much as your JPEG, but it will be an image sequence. That's the best way to render any VFX that you're doing. You don't necessarily want to render out of the film, because if anything goes wrong, then you lose the whole render. Whereas a PNG or JPEG sequence, you can go back and start again halfway through if you wanted. Once you've done that, click Accept, and then just click Render Local, and this window will pop up. It will initialize your render. Once it's compiled shaders, and then it will be really super quick, or hopefully it should be really super quick, and render out your film. Here we go. So you can see mine is now rendering out the 120 frames. There we go. And once that closes, we're all done. That's how you render out your film. You just need to take that into an editing software, which could be After Effects, Premiere Pro, DaVinci Resolve, Avid, whatever you want to use, and just import it as an image sequence and then render that out as the video and do any post-production that you want to. And that's all done. That is how you use Unreal Engine to add in a world, an environment, textures, materials, lighting, and also objects, and animate them as well. So hopefully you found that useful, and yeah, I'll be making some more videos for you in the future, so I'll make sure that those get sent over to you as well. Awesome. Take care.